Hello and welcome to the GCSE Chemistry tutorial for topic C8 Chemical Analysis. This tutorial will cover part 2, Analysing Substances, and we'll look at the practicals for testing for anions and testing for cations. First of all, testing for anions. These are negative ions. The test for carbonates. If you add hydrochloric acid to the sample and then bubble the gas that you make through lime water, if it's a carbonate, it will turn cloudy. The test for sulfates. If you add hydrochloric acid and then a few drops of barium chloride solution, if a sulfate is present, you'll get a white precipitate. Finally, halides. If you add dilute nitric acid and silver nitrate solution, you'll get different colour precipitates depending on the halide. If it's a chloride, you'll form a white precipitate of silver chloride. If it's a bromide, you'll make a cream precipitate of silver bromide. And if it's iodide, you'll make a yellow precipitate of silver iodide. Testing for cations. Cations are positive ions. One way you can test for these is using a flame test. To carry out a flame test, you get a metal wire loop. Often it's made of a metal like nichrome. And you would clean it first and sterilise it in a blue flame of the Bunsen. Then you will dip the loop into a sample that you want to test, which is shown on the picture. And then you will place that wire loop through a blue flame and look at the colour change. So these colour changes you need to know for the different cations. Lithium ions would give a crimson flame, sodium would give a yellow flame, potassium a lilac flame, calcium a brick red flame, and copper a green flame. You can also test for cations by adding them to sodium hydroxide, because some of them will form coloured precipitates. Calcium will form a white precipitate with sodium hydroxide. Copper will form a blue precipitate. Iron 2+ will form a green precipitate, but iron 3+ will form a brown precipitate. Aluminium will form a white colour at first, then it will react fully and form a colourless solution, and then magnesium will form a white precipitate. Make sure you learn the ionic equations for this as well. Notice that the precipitates formed are solids. Flame emission spectroscopy can also be used to identify different ions. The sample is placed in a flame. As the ions heat up, the electrons become excited and then start to release energy as light. The light is then passed through something called a spectroscope, and that interprets different wavelengths of light into a line spectrum. And each ion produces a different line spectrum. So you can use this to identify different ions and find out the strength and the concentration of the ions in different mixtures. Now, this kind of method is very accurate, it's quick, and it's sensitive to even small amounts of chemicals. If you pause the tutorial now and give yourself 10 minutes to answer the following. How do you test to see if something's calcium carbonate? Well, first of all, the calcium part. To test for calcium ions, you can do a flame test and it will go brick red, or you can add sodium hydroxide and it will form a white precipitate. To test for the carbonate ions, you add hydrochloric acid, then bubble the gas through lime water and it will turn cloudy. To test for copper sulfate, first the copper ions, you would do a flame test and it will give a green flame. Or you can add sodium hydroxide and it will form a blue precipitate. To test for the sulfate ions, you would add hydrochloric acid and barium chloride and you'd form a white precipitate. Finally, potassium chloride. You would do a flame test to give a lilac flame. And then to test for the chloride part, you would add hydrochloric acid and silver nitrate and you'd form a white precipitate. We've looked at analysing substances, testing for anions and cations.